The Balfour Declaration was a letter from the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Walter Rothschild, 2nd Baron Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The text of the letter was published in the press 1 week later, on the 9th of November 1917. The Balfour Declaration was later incorporated into both the Sèvres Peace Treaty with the Ottoman Empire and the Mandate for Palestine. The original document is kept at the British Library. The declaration was in contrast to the Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence, which promised the Arab independence movement control of the Middle East territories, in the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sheriff of Mecca, in exchange for revolting against the Ottoman Empire. Background: World War I. In 1914, war broke out in Europe between the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. The war on the Western Front developed into a stalemate. Jonathan Schneer writes, thus the view from Whitehall early in 1916. If defeat was not imminent, neither was victory, and the outcome of the war of attrition on the Western Front could not be predicted. The colossal forces in a death grip across Europe and in Eurasia appeared to have cancelled each other out. Only the addition of significant new forces on one side or the other seemed likely to tip the scale. Britain's willingness, beginning early in 1916, to explore seriously some kind of arrangement with World Jewry, or Great Jewry, must be understood in this context. Zionism. In 1896, Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist living in Austria-Hungary, published Der Judenstaat, in which he asserted that the only solution to the Jewish question in Europe, including growing antisemitism, was through the establishment of a state for the Jews. Political Zionism had just been born. A year later, Herzl founded the Zionist Organization, which at its first Congress called for the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured under public law. Serviceable means to attain that goal included the promotion of Jewish settlement there, the organization of Jews in the diaspora, the strengthening of Jewish feeling and consciousness, and preparatory steps to attain those necessary governmental grants. Herzl died in 1904 without the political standing that was required to carry out his agenda of a Jewish home in Palestine. During the first meeting between Chaim Wiseman and Balfour in 1906, Balfour asked what Wiseman's objections were to the idea of a Jewish homeland in Uganda, rather than in Palestine. According to Wiseman's memoir, the conversation went as follows. Mr. Balfour, supposing I was to offer you Paris instead of London, would you take it? He sat up, looked at me, and answered, but drive. Wiseman, we have London. That is true, I said, but we had Jerusalem when London was a marsh. He said two things which I remember vividly. The first was, are there many Jews who think like you? I answered, I believe I speak the mind of millions of Jews whom you will never see and who cannot speak for themselves. To this he said, if that is so you will one day be a force. 2 months after Britain's declaration of war on the Ottoman Empire in November 1914, Zionist British cabinet member Herbert Samuel circulated a memorandum entitled The Future of Palestine to his cabinet colleagues. The memorandum stated that, I am assured that the solution of the problem of Palestine, which would be much the most welcome to the leaders and supporters of the Zionist movement throughout the world, would be the annexation of the country to the British Empire. The Mcmahon-Hussein Correspondence. Henry Mcmahon had exchanged letters with Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca in 1915, in which he had promised Hussein control of Arab lands with the exception of portions of Syria, lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama and Aleppo. Palestine lay to the southwest of the Vilayet of Damascus and wasn't explicitly mentioned. That modern-day Lebanese region of the Mediterranean coast was set aside as part of a future French mandate. After the war, the extent of the coastal exclusion was hotly disputed. Hussein had protested that the Arabs of Beirut would greatly oppose isolation from the Arab state or states, but did not bring up the matter of Jerusalem or Palestine. This interpretation was supported explicitly by the British government in the 1922 White Paper. On the basis of Mcmahon's assurances, the Arab revolt began on 5 June 1916. However, the British and French also secretly concluded the Sykes-Picot Agreement on 16 May 1916. This agreement divided many Arab territories into British and French-administered areas and allowed for the internationalization of Palestine. Hussein learned of the agreement when it was leaked by the new Soviet government in December 1917, but was satisfied by two disingenuous telegrams from Sir Reginald Wingate, High Commissioner of Egypt, assuring him that the British government's commitments to the Arabs were still valid and that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was not a formal treaty. Hussein called on the Arab population in Palestine to welcome the Jews as brethren and cooperate with them for the common welfare. Following the publication of the declaration, the British had dispatched Commander David George Hogarth to see Hussein in January 1918, bearing the message that the political and economic freedom of the Palestinian population was not in question. Hogarth reported that Hussein would not accept an independent Jewish state in Palestine, nor was I instructed to warn him that such a state was contemplated by Great Britain. Continuing Arab disquiet over Allied intentions also led during 1918 to the British Declaration to the Seven and the Anglo-French Declaration, the latter promising the complete and final liberation of the peoples who have for so long been oppressed by the Turks, and the setting up of national governments and administrations deriving their authority from the free exercise of the initiative and choice of the indigenous populations. Lord Grey had been the Foreign Secretary during the Mcmahon-Hussein negotiations. Speaking in the House of Lords on 27 March 1923, he made it clear that he entertained serious doubts as to the validity of the British government's interpretation of the pledges which he, as Foreign Secretary, had caused to be given to Hussein in 1915. He called for all of the secret engagements regarding Palestine to be made public. Many of the relevant documents in the National Archives were later declassified and published. Among them were the minutes of a Cabinet Eastern Committee meeting, chaired by Lord Curzon, which was held on 5 December 1918. Balfour was in attendance. The minutes revealed that in laying out the government's position, Curzon had explained that Palestine was included in the areas as to which Great Britain pledged itself that they should be Arab and independent in the future. Sykes-Picot Agreement. In May 1916, the governments of the United Kingdom, France and Russia signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which defined their proposed spheres of influence and control in Western Asia should the Triple Entente succeed in defeating the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, the agreement effectively divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire outside the Arabian Peninsula into areas of future British and French control or influence. The agreement proposed that an international administration would be established in an area shaded brown on the agreement's map, which was later to become Palestine, and that the form of the administration would be decided upon after consultation with Russia, and subsequently in consultation with the other allies, and the representatives of the Sharif of Mecca. Zionists believed their aspirations had been passed over. William Reginald Hall, British Director of Naval Intelligence, criticised the agreement on the basis that the Jews have a strong material and a very strong political interest in the future of the country, and that, in the Brown area, the question of Zionism, and also of British control of all Palestine railways, in the interest of Egypt, have to be considered. Motivation for the declaration. British government. James Galvin, a Middle East history professor, cites at least 3 reasons for why the British government chose to support Zionist aspirations. Issuing the Balfour Declaration would appeal to 2 of Woodrow Wilson's closest advisers, who were avid Zionists. The British did not know quite what to make of President Woodrow Wilson and his conviction that the way to end hostilities was for both sides to accept peace without victory. 2 of Wilson's closest advisers, Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, were avid Zionists. How better to shore up an uncertain ally than by endorsing Zionist aims? The British adopted similar thinking when it came to the Russians, who were in the midst of their revolution. Several of the most prominent revolutionaries, including Leon Trotsky, were of Jewish descent. Why not see if they could be persuaded to keep Russia in the war by appealing to their latent Jewishness and giving them another reason to continue the fight? These include not only those already mentioned but also Britain's desire to attract Jewish financial resources. At that time the British were busy making promises. At a war cabinet meeting, held on the 31st of October 1917, Balfour suggested that a declaration favourable to Zionist aspirations would allow Great Britain to carry on extremely useful propaganda both in Russia and America. The cabinet believed that expressing support would appeal to Jews in Germany and America, and help the war effort. It was also hoped to encourage support from the large Jewish population in Russia. According to James Renton, senior lecturer at Edge Hill University, and author of The Zionist Masquerade, The Birth of the Anglo-Zionist Alliance, 1914–1918, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine because it would help secure post-war British control of Palestine, which was strategically important as a buffer to Egypt and the Suez Canal. In addition, Palestine was to later serve as a terminus for the flow of petroleum from Iraq via Jordan. 3 former Ottoman Turkish provinces that became British League of Nations mandates in the aftermath of the First World War. The oil officially flowed along the Mosul-Haifa oil pipeline from 1935 to 1948, and unofficially up until 1954. David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister at the time of the Balfour Declaration, told the Palestine Royal Commission in 1937 that the declaration was made due to propagandist reasons, citing the position of the Allied and associated powers in the ongoing war. Lloyd George said, in the report's words, "In this critical situation it was believed that Jewish sympathy or the reverse would make a substantial difference one way or the other to the Allied cause. In particular, Jewish sympathy would confirm the support of American Jewry, and would make it more difficult for Germany to reduce her military commitments and improve her economic position on the Eastern Front." Lloyd George then said the Zionist leaders gave us a definite promise that, if the Allies committed themselves to giving facilities for the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, they would do their best to rally Jewish sentiment and support throughout the world to the Allied cause. They kept their word. Regarding the intended future of Palestine, Lloyd George testified, "The idea was, and this was the interpretation put upon it at the time, that a Jewish state was not to be set up immediately by the peace treaty without reference to the wishes of the majority of the inhabitants. On the other hand, it was contemplated that when the time arrived for according representative institutions to Palestine, if the Jews had meanwhile responded to the opportunity afforded them by the idea of a national home and had become a definite majority of the inhabitants, then Palestine would thus become a Jewish commonwealth." In his memoirs, published in 1939, Lloyd George further elucidated his position. The Balfour Declaration represented the convinced policy of all parties in our country and also in America, but the launching of it in 1917 was due, as I have said, to propagandist reasons. The Zionist movement was exceptionally strong in Russia and America. It was believed, also, that such a declaration would have a potent influence upon world Jewry outside Russia, and secure for the Entente the aid of Jewish financial interests. In America, their aid in this respect would have a special value when the Allies had almost exhausted the gold and marketable securities available for American purchases. Such were the chief considerations which, in 1917, impelled the British government towards making a contract with Jewry. Britain planned that once Palestine had been conquered, the establishment of a national home for Jewish people will ward off the inevitable French pressure for an international administration. Wiseman-Balfour relationship. One of the main proponents of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was Chaim Wiseman, the leading spokesperson in Britain for organized Zionism. Wiseman was a chemist who had developed a process to synthesize acetone via fermentation. Acetone is required for the production of cordite, a powerful propellant explosive needed to fire ammunition without generating telltale smoke. Germany had cornered supplies of calcium acetate, a major source of acetone. Other pre-war processes in Britain were inadequate to meet the increased demand in World War I, and a shortage of cordite would have severely hampered Britain's war effort. Lloyd George, then Minister for Munitions, was grateful to Wiseman and so supported his Zionist aspirations. In his war memoirs, Lloyd George wrote of meeting Wiseman in 1916 that Wiseman explained his aspirations as to the repatriation of the Jews to the sacred land they had made famous. That was the fountain origin of the famous declaration about the national home for the Jews in Palestine. As soon as I became Prime Minister, I talked the whole matter over with Mr. Balfour, who was then Foreign Secretary. This may, however, have been only a part of a longer series of discussions about Britain and Zionism held between Wiseman and Balfour, which had begun at least a decade earlier. In late 1905, Balfour had requested of Charles Dreyfus, his Jewish constituency representative, that he arrange a meeting with Wiseman, during which Wiseman asked for official British support for Zionism. They were to meet again on this issue in 1914. Jewish national home versus Jewish state. Explication of the wording of the Balfour Declaration is found in the correspondence leading to the final version of the declaration. The phrase, national home, was intentionally used instead of state, because of opposition to the Zionist program within the British cabinet. Following discussion of the initial draft, the Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sykes, met with the Zionist negotiators to clarify their aims. His official report back to the cabinet categorically stated that the Zionists did not want to set up a Jewish republic or any other form of state in Palestine immediately, but rather preferred some form of protectorate as provided in the Palestine Mandate. In approving the Balfour Declaration, Leopold Amery, one of the secretaries to the British War Cabinet of 1917-18, testified under oath to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in January 1946 from his personal knowledge that the phrase, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, was intended and understood by all concerned to mean at the time of the Balfour Declaration that Palestine would ultimately become a Jewish Commonwealth, or a Jewish state. If only Jews came and settled there in sufficient numbers. Both the Zionist organization and the British government devoted efforts over the following decades, including Winston Churchill's 1922 White Paper, to denying that a state was the intention. However, in private, many British officials agreed with the interpretation of the Zionists that a state would be established when a Jewish majority was achieved. The initial draft of the declaration, contained in a letter sent by Rothschild to Balfour, referred to the principle that Palestine should be reconstituted as the national home of the Jewish people. In the final text, the word that was replaced with "in" to avoid committing the entirety of Palestine to this purpose. Similarly, an early draft did not include the commitment that nothing should be done which might prejudice the rights of the non-Jewish communities. These changes came about partly as the result of the urgings of Edwin Samuel Montagu, an influential anti-Zionist Jew and Secretary of State for India. Montagu, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, voiced his opposition by declaring, "The policy of His Majesty's government is anti-Semitic in result and will prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country of the world." The draft was circulated, and during October the government received replies from various representatives of the Jewish community. Lord Rothschild took exception to the new proviso on the basis that it presupposed the possibility of a danger to non-Zionists, which he denied. At San Remo, as shown in the transcript of the San Remo meeting on the evening of the 24th of April, the French proposed adding to the savings clause, so that it would save for non-Jewish communities their political rights, as well as their civil and religious rights. The French proposal was rejected.